Hello, I'm Noelle, and I'm making this video because I recently finished Angela Carter's short story collection, The Bloody Chamber, for the first time. I'd read one story from it, The Company of Wolves, after I saw the movie that was made in the 1980s and directed by Neil Jordan. And it's actually one of my favorite movies. A very bizarre take on Little Red Riding Hood, I guess. You can imagine The Company of Wolves is about werewolves. And Angela Carter wrote this short story collection based on fairy tales in 1979. So she was one of the first writers to adapt fairy tales with a feminist bent. This is quite a short collection. It's very florid writing. There are lots of themes of women as the victim of powerful men and their conqueror. And they're not usually women, actually, they're adolescents. They've just become a woman. And the florid writing sometimes is a bit much. There are so many details and so many gorgeous words, but it does kind of fit the fanciful world she's of course creating. So she's trying to turn a lot of these stories that were often about girls in distress into tales of female sexual empowerment. One of the most chilling stories is probably The Bloody Chamber, which is also the longest story, and it's her take on Bluebeard, which is a creepy French fairy tale, possibly with origins elsewhere, and it's kind of found throughout Europe, about a nobleman with a blue beard and lots of money whose wives somehow managed to die. It's sort of like the male version of a Black Widow. So she really has time to create this eerie world, and the description of Bluebeard is very eerie. She describes him as this huge but very quiet man who seems to be wearing a mask at all times, and she doesn't see any appeal in him except for that he is clearly hiding something, and that other women seem to have found something appealing in him. So one of my favorite lines in that story happens after their wedding night. In the course of that one-sided struggle, I had seen his deathly composure shatter like a porcelain vase flung against a wall. It's just a terrifying, if brief, depiction of someone who wears different masks and who really does have that Jekyll and Hyde personality, one that they present to others and one that's the beast within, which is another huge theme of this. I said to my friend, this is basically just about furries, because in a huge portion of the stories, a woman marries an animal or an animalistic man. I would say my least favorite story is probably Puss in Boots, which just has a very different tone from the other, so it depends on your taste. It's much more lighthearted, and it's really just a sex romp, but I didn't feel like there were very high stakes, so I wasn't that invested in it. So I definitely recommend Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber if you're interested in fairy tales, though it might not be your cup of tea. It might be a bit too much over the top, very emotional. I also wanted to talk about a book that I read more than 5 years ago now, which is also about fairy tales. It's My Mother, She Killed Me, My Father, He Ate Me. 40 New Fairy Tales, edited by Kate Bernheimer, and it includes all sorts of amazing writers like Kelly Link, who introduced the version of The Bloody Chamber I had. She wrote a beautiful introduction for that. Francine Prose, Joyce Carol Oates, Shelley Jackson, Neil Gaiman, and I think John Updike also wrote one of these stories. The title, My Mother, She Killed Me, My Father, He Ate Me, is based on the Grimm's fairy tale, The Juniper Tree. I mean, as you can imagine, that's quite an eerie title, and the picture, this is a pot with a gold braid, which is not from that, but you get the idea. This book is actually dedicated to Angela Carter. Some of these stories are very funny, modern adaptations. Others are set in this a sort of a fantastical setting, some are almost a sci-fi twist, some are quite surreal. I really enjoyed reading some stories that were based on fairy tales I wasn't as familiar with, like those from Japan and Vietnam. I would say a couple that I remember from all those years ago include Joelle McSweeney's The Warm Mouth, which is based on the Grimm brothers' story, The Bremen Town Musicians, which I haven't read, or if I did read it was a long time ago and I don't remember it exactly. But I'll read the little excerpt they have at the beginning. Warm Mouth, chin scraper, why are you lying down there in the road with your jaw shoved back through your brain and your guts blown out as if you tried to swallow the highway? So that explains almost nothing, but it is a very bizarre work and it's extremely visceral and disgusting. I felt so grossed out by the time I finished it, but I have never forgotten it, even though it's unsure what's going on. It's almost like the blob phenomenon. It's these body parts that are going around consuming things, and it's described in such a detail, but it's so vividly told that it is certainly effective. My favorite short story in this collection is Jim Shepard's Pleasure Boating in Lituya Bay, which is based on an Italian fairy tale called Jump Into My Sack, which I'm not familiar with. So I'll just read the excerpt here as well. 2.5 weeks after I was born, on July 9th, 1958, the plates that make up the Fairweather Range in the Alaskan Panhandle apparently slipped 21 feet on either side of the Fairweather Fault. His is a realistic take on the fairy tale, and it's about a man who was born during a huge tsunami in Alaska, and that trauma has stuck with him his whole life, and so he often compares his instability and this subtle disturbance within him. Because he was so young, he doesn't remember what it was like, but he feels what it was like, and he often compares that feeling to the tremors that caused the tsunami, and it translates into how he relates to his wife and his family and how he sees his future. It's yet another dark story that of course I really liked, but it's quite subtle, and unlike a lot of the other ones is kind of quiet, and like I said, it's more realism, it's modern day. So I don't know exactly how it is as an adaptation, but as a short story I loved it. So yeah, I definitely recommend this book, and as you can see, I've been in a bit of a fairy tale kick, and I enjoyed the Bloody Chamber so much, I decided to revisit this and talk about them as a pair. And I might do that a few more times in a few more videos, just talk about two books or pieces of art that I think go together well. Anyway, thanks for checking this out, and go read your fairy tales if you so desire. Bye!